Scripture comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verses 14 to 30. For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. And then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. The one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with 10 talents. To all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Parables are tricky. How in the world do we read a story like that and make sense of it? Most of us learned to read these stories as if they were allegories, and we took each of the characters in the story and we would say, well, that is this person and that is that. Usually one of the characters we assigned the role of God, and usually one of the characters we assigned to ourselves. Right? Well, back in the 1960s, there was a biblical scholar named Jeremias who wrote a seminal book on the parables called The Parables of Jesus, in which he said that allegory is not the way that Jewish folk understood these stories, and not the way Jesus meant for them to be read. He said, instead, each parable has a single point that we're supposed to read and hear that single point, and the details really just point in that direction. And indeed, since then, most scholars have agreed that that's exactly how they were meant to be read. Still, most of us learned to read them as allegories. And for most of us, myself included, that's the first place we go. And indeed, that's the first place my mind goes with this particular parable. But it's not an easy place to go with an allegory, is it? If the businessman equals God, that is not a very happy picture of God, is it? Indeed, the third servant says, essentially, I know you're a crook. And the businessman says, well, yep, you're right, I am. So you should have known better because you don't mess around with crooks' money. Still, it is a compelling story. And it falls in the lectionary at this time of year, every 3 years, and it happens also to be the time when most churches are doing their stewardship campaigns, and so it's a happy thing and it falls there, and we like to think of this in terms of stewardship. And so you'll see my sermon titled, The Good Steward, and that is what lots of folk preach on. And indeed, when I look back in my database of all of my sermons, every 3 years I preach on this passage at this time of year. Forever and ever, amen. And most of those sermons have had to do with stewardship. And they've come back with me ending by saying something like, so now when you fill out your card that Jean Lucas has sent out to you asking for your commitment for giving for the next year, do so as a good steward and be ready then to hear those words, well done, thou good and faithful servant. And it falls there happily and easily. But I'm not sure that's exactly what Jesus had in mind. Remember all of that as you fill out your little card, but I'm not sure that that's what this passage is really about. When we ask the question, what was that single point that Jesus was trying to make? And then ask the parallel question, why did Matthew tell this story to his church? What did he want them to hear? I think the point becomes fairly clear. A few years ago, I read a book, and this idea from the book has stuck with me to the point that it's dug its way into my brain, but I can't for the life of me even remember what the title of the book was or who wrote it. So don't go looking for it because I'm no help. But the issue in the book that stuck with me was he talked about his dog. Now I know that Jessica, her family, they have a Chihuahua. Two Chihuahuas.
Well, they're mixed. They're not complete Chihuahuas. They're mixed.
They're mixed, so they're not. So there's
they're
something
not hideous.
Well, in the book, the author talks about his dog that's a Chihuahua, and he talks about the Chihuahua brain. And he pictures this little dog, and this little dog sees everything as a threat and responds to everything like that. The smallest provocation, this little dog is barking. And maybe even biting. And it doesn't matter how big the threat seems to be, it goes right into attack mode. Right into attack mode. Now, the dog, he says, lives in a very secure house. They've got locks on the doors. There are no strangers who come marching in. There is nothing to be afraid of in that house, but still the dog is always ready and always just a hair trigger away from attack mode. There's more than adequate food. There is no real threat, but the dog has a Chihuahua brain, and the Chihuahua brain says, get ready, it's coming. And I'm bad. And it doesn't matter that the troubles, the fears are unknown or even unreal. Those dangers are always right there in this little Chihuahua brain. The author went on to say that we as humans, somewhere in our evolutionary history, have Chihuahua brains. And we look for threats and we respond accordingly. Now, there is a time in history when it was necessary. There was a time when you were out marching through the bush and there might have been a predator there hiding, waiting, just licking its chops, waiting for you to come by and be lunch. There were times when the neighboring tribe was kind of hiding out there, waiting for just the right moment to attack and steal all of your food and land and take your children off as slaves. But times have changed. Times have changed. One commentator that I recently read referred to our time as the safest time in history. You wouldn't know that from the internet, would you? Now, it's true that wars could be more horrific now than they have ever been, and we've got these low-grade wars. Low-grade, I know that's not a very accurate thing to say if you happen to be living there. But it's not like it has been in much of history. We have more peace now than ever before. Really, we do. And the wars that are going on, those of us sitting here, we have no experience of that at all. You know, it's not like when I grew up and every evening on the news we saw the death count in Vietnam. When all of my friends were looking at their draft numbers and thinking, oh no, here I go. When my brother-in-law decided, I'm going to be a teacher, not because I care about education, but because that keeps me from getting drafted. It's not like that. We have a legal system that keeps us extremely safe from our neighbors. And studies show that the vast amount of violence that happens from those who are closest to us, from our friends and our family. And so if we've happened to have been smart and chosen our friends and family carefully, we're pretty secure. We're pretty secure. It's true we don't have the degree of social safety nets that many of the developed countries in the world have, but it's still a lot better than it was not all that long ago in history, when children went and worked in the mines and the factories, and those of us who had those jobs as adults worked until we died. And we died much too young and much too sick. We have secure networks of friends, of family, of churches, and we live more securely than any people have in the history of the world. You and I. But we still have Chihuahua brains. We still have Chihuahua brains. And it doesn't take much to get it barking. And politicians know that. And so, the politicians on the right have said, let's build a wall to keep them out, because if they get through, they're going to take everything we have. Lower taxes on corporations and the rich folk, or they will take your jobs and send them overseas. Spend more on the military and shut down immigration, or ISIS will attack us and impose Sharia law on all of us. Allow the other party to win, and the world will end as you know it. And the Chihuahua starts barking. And suddenly folk stop thinking, and they stop acting according to their values. For example, overwhelmingly, Americans are for gun control, yet they vote folk in who have said that they will not impose any new gun control. Indeed, they will try to get rid of what we already have. They overwhelmingly are for tax increases, and yet they elect those who say they'll take those tax increases, or they'll give tax breaks to the rich and wealthy and take away the social security nets. Overwhelmingly, people are for raising the minimum wage, and they elect those who say, no, we shouldn't have a minimum wage at all. They are overwhelmingly for the key features of the Affordable Care Act, and yet vote people in who say that their primary goal is to get it rescinded, or if they can't do that, at least to cut the funding so it doesn't work. Now, I don't want to pick only on the folk on the right, because they're not the only ones who try to get the Chihuahuas barking. Folk on the left do it. They do it too. They just weren't quite as skilled at it. Didn't do as good a job, and so the left's voters didn't come out. They were out there yelling the same things. If you don't vote against the folk on the right, all of these terrible things will happen to you. And they said that. Again, they just didn't say it quite as clearly. Presumably, the folk on the left weren't quite as frightened. And indeed, psychological studies do show that it's easier to motivate people in a conservative direction when they're frightened than it is to motivate them in a liberal one. Now, the folk on the left are trying again. They're looking at the elections, the midterm elections in 18, and they're trying real hard to get people afraid. In the couple of special elections that have happened, they've been trying real hard to get those Chihuahua brains barking, but they're learning, I think, that it takes a little more on the left side than just the Chihuahua brains. You've got to offer something positive as well, because it's easier to motivate people to hunker down when they're afraid than it is to move forward. But politicians on both sides have learned that those Chihuahua brains are really powerful in spite of the fact that they're little tiny dogs. And we all have them. And because of that, I understand the third guy in today's scripture. That's what motivated him. His Chihuahua was barking really loud. Really loud. It was a time when risk was real. It was real. If he had taken the money to the bank and the bank closed, it was gone. There was no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to protect those investments. It was gone. There was no possibility of a lawsuit if someone ran off with the money and went instead to Bermuda and had a lovely, lovely time. There was nothing that could be done. Rome could take whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, and there was no recourse. Even the Pax Romana that allowed that world to be more secure than it had ever been before wasn't all that pax in Israel, because even then it was a place that was known for terrorism. And there were lots of terrorists who were just as happy. They didn't have bombs, but they still had knives. And they would do anything and everything they could to disrupt a peaceful society. Nothing was secure. And this third guy, he knew that for this master, no loss would be acceptable. And it was big bucks we were talking about. Now, we read that word talent, and I don't know what you think of, but I think of our English use of that word. Their talents. They were great singers, or wonderful piano players, or they could they could decorate the communion table and make it look so gorgeous that you just wanted to sit and say, yeah. That's not what it was. That's where our word comes from, but it was an economic term, and actually it was a measure of weight. About 75 pounds. And usually when they talked about talents, they were referring to either gold, sometimes silver. But we're talking a lot of money here. Now, I did some looking to see what exactly it meant at the time of Jesus, and I got some different ideas. One person said that it was equal to about 15 years of labor. So we can figure out what that might look like if that was today. 15 years of kind of a lower level labor job. Maybe the person's making $18 an hour, working 40 hours a week. For 15 years, that comes out to $561,000. That's kind of the low end of what this talent might have been. Another person said, no, it actually is 75 pounds. And I looked up yesterday to see what 75 pounds of gold would be worth at today's value. 1.45 million. So one talent here, we're looking at somewhere between $500,000 and $1.5 million. This is a lot of money. This is a lot of money. And here this first servant, or the third servant, gets that. $500,000 to $1.5 million. The first servant gets 5 times that. Maybe $7.5 million. Here, take care of this. I'm out of here. And then $3 million to the second servant. Imagine what would have happened if that first servant had lost $7.5 million and this crook of a business person comes back and says, okay, where's my money? Oh, all gone. Lost it. I tried to invest it. It's all gone away. It would have been ugly. Heck, even the third servant, who only had one talent, $500,000 to $1.5 million. Oh, sorry, I invested it. It's all gone. It's not a wonder that the third servant, Chihuahua, was barking. Being safe made sense. And indeed, Jesus' audience would have identified with that third servant. As soon as they got this picture, here is this business person who he takes advantage of people. He has made this money by stealing, by taking what he didn't work for. No, you don't mess with that kind of person. They would have identified with the third servant. Yep, bury it. Keep it safe. And there was no guarantee in the early part of the story that there would be any benefit from taking a risk. The business person didn't say, here, take care of my money, make lots more, and I'll give you a bonus when I come back. There was none of that. These weren't even employees. These were slaves. All they could reasonably expect was that when the boss came back, things would be as they had been in the past. So, why take a risk? The Chihuahua was barking really loud. Why tempt fate? Why waste that amount of money that the boss had left behind? Life is difficult and risky enough. Why open the possibility of things getting worse? Especially when there is no reason to expect an upside. Lose it, punishment will come. Make money, probably nothing good's going to happen from that. The Chihuahua was barking, and it was reasonable. And here's where we get to what I think Jesus was saying to his followers and what Matthew was saying to his church. Jesus is not interested in safe. Jesus is not interested in safe. Take the gifts that God has given you and use them for the kingdom. Transform the world. Risky stewardship is the only way to go. Now, there aren't any guarantees. Just taking risks doesn't mean that things are going to turn out right. You know that. The Chihuahuas evolved for a reason. But we know that if you bury the resources in the ground, the only thing you get are dirty resources. All of those wonderful futures for which they dreamt, for which they yearned, none of that could happen if they buried those resources. And the early followers of Jesus knew just that. Beginning with the 12, they risked everything, and God blessed them. They experienced the touch of God in their lives. Their lives were transformed. They experienced new possibilities. Now, some of them also died for their faith. The risks didn't always pay off exactly as they had hoped. But the blessings that came were blessings that could not have happened otherwise. They found themselves part of the blessed community. They found themselves experiencing God's grace in a world that had never happened before. Where Paul says there is no Jew or Greek, there is no male or female, there is no slave or free. That didn't happen anywhere else and couldn't have happened anywhere else had they not taken the risk to be the people of God. And the gospel spread, and the good news grew. Again, sometimes it hurt. Sometimes they experienced persecution. Some of them even died as a result. But the church moved forward, and God's kingdom came each day a little more fully. Now, Matthew's church comes some years after these words were spoken by Jesus, and they were afraid. They were wanting, let's just hunker down. Let's just wait. We can close ourselves off. We can wait until things kind of pass over. It might take a few years, it might take a generation, but then it'll be safe. And then we can come out and say, we're followers of Jesus. And Matthew says to them, no, let me remind you what Jesus said. You can vary things until it gets safer, but all you end up with then are dirty resources. Playing it safe is never enough. If you don't use the gifts that God has blessed you with, the only thing you're guaranteed is that the blessings for which you yearn will never, ever come. So don't listen to the chihuahuas. You and I, in addition to living in the most secure time of the world, also live in a time that is more blessed than any time in the world. We have more resources of every kind, including the most important ones of all, the ability to dream a better world, the ability to see that new kingdom for which God yearns. And you and I can be part of it. We have more money than any people have had in history. We have the ability to pool our talents in ways that never has happened before. We have the ability to pull our skills together. And you and I have political power that no one has ever had before. We can make things change. We can. We can work for a better world in ways that nobody else has ever had the opportunity. You and I live in a country where we have freedom to be God's people. And no one can tell you what that looks like, except Jesus. That's different than pretty much anywhere else in the world. And there's a reason why Americans are more religious than any other developed nation. And I think that's it. It's because the government was smart enough to know from the very beginning, those who framed the Constitution, to say, let's keep our hands off this and let it be between individuals and God and watch what God can do when we get out of the way. And the call to us is to be good stewards. And good stewards means to take risks. Chihuahuas are going to bark, and there are those who are going to try to use that to further their own ends, whether they be political or social or whatever. And sometimes there are things that the Chihuahuas ought to be barking about. But even then, Jesus calls us to risky stewardship. Now, I don't know what that means for you in your life. Only you can answer what that exactly means for you. I have some ideas of what it looks like for me. I was at a meeting this week where some of the folk from the New Sanctuary movement were talking about how their vision of the church being called to stand on the sides of undocumented folk. And one of the people used a statement that really stuck with me. She said, we need to have strong backs and soft fronts. We need to know what we believe, what we think, and stand up for that. But we need to do that in a way that is gentle and loving and accepting. And we need to be willing to listen to those folk with whom we differ about whatever issue happens to be. And I loved that picture. A strong back, a solid back, and a soft front. And I struggle with that sometimes. You know, it's easy for preachers to get preachy. I don't do that, right?
No.
Sometimes. Maybe all the time. For us as a congregation, it is for us to continue to offer good news that is really good news. and to speak of God's wonderful dream of a blessed community, and not to be and to call for that blessed community to come in its fullness for everyone. God's yearnings are more wonderful than any of us have even imagined. And we can't get there without being willing to risk. It's a risk. But the alternative is not a good one. Burying those gifts, those possibilities that God has given to us only gets us dirty talents. But if we spend them, if we take the risk of using them for God's kingdom, well, who knows what might